Right, we're now standing at the bottom of the Balindore Road, and I think this is a very important area from the point of view of prehistory, because this green mound you can see in front of you here is called in Gaelic the Wasteland of the Standing Stones, plural, and that is where the standing stone which forms Nelson's monument was drawn from. Behind me here on this road there's a settlement called Balindore. Now in Gaelic that means the township of a hereditary keeper of a holy relic, who was named a Jewer in Gaelic and Jewer in English. And the relic in question here is reputed to have been the monastic staff or bishop's staff or saint's staff of Saint Mulruagh, who was a well-known saint in Scotland in the 6th century and left his name to various settlements here and there, particularly one here behind Connell. There's a set of lochs called the Black Lochs, in Gaelic, and on one of the lochs there's an island there which is probably a crannog, and it's known as Eilean and Takirst in Gaelic, the saints, the priest's island. And certainly there was somebody there, a cleric or a Jewer of some kind, that held probably the bachel of St Mulruagh, the staff of St Mulruagh, because I've seen a 16th century bond of Manrent, I think it was, which is in the castle at Inverera, which said that this oath was sworn on the Mass book and on the Ard Vachel, which means the high, the great crozier, on the Isle of St Mulruagh in the Black Lochs. So the bachel was, this staff was in existence at that time, and it's alleged that the hereditary keeper of the bachel, inevitably a Campbell, was living at Balindore here and held the ground there, and so that would have been very much a powerful place to go to, you know, because this holy relic was there. And my own theory is that the road leading into Glenlonnan would come to the church here, would stop at the cross which stood on a little eminence of high ground just where the present railway bridge is in Tinalt there, before Ceàrd, and would move up here through one way or another. There's various footpaths and things here onto this area here and join the Glenlonnan Road, but that is only my own theory. I don't know whether that would be true or not. But one of the interesting things here is that if you face Cruachan and look over, do you see this green hillock here, a long hillock?
Yes.
Just this side of a bunch of trees there. That's called in Gaelic an Cìrean, which is a word for a coxcomb, and it's sort of shaped like that. And down below, I know where to look, but it's quite difficult. In front of us here we have a hawthorn tree, and if you follow the Cìrean along, you'll see a round erratic block
Yes.
on the hillside there, and that's called Clach Uaigh. But I think that may be a corruption. That means cuckoo stone, because here below us there's a stream runs down here, and that's known in Gaelic as Altachadh, which means the stream of discussion or resolution. And I think that may be corruption of the word, which eventually became corrupted as Cuac, Uaigh, and was obviously a place where, in this area, people resolved boundary disputes. And if you look at this area, it's not quite so clear today, but it's clear with a low sun. This whole place is covered with lacy beds, or Fiannachen in Gaelic, which was the rig and furrow culture, which was done, cultivated by the people who lived in hamlets of Ceàrd and Hafton and Aird's Bay. Very hard work, with the men digging them by hand and the women bringing up creels full of seaweed and things, and they grew their oats and barley in here, and it was protected by walls made of Carragh, they call them in Gaelic. They're turf walls with probably a quickset hedge on the top, and in fact, just behind me here, there's a very good example of it running along, and in taking in this hill with the masts on top of it, which is called Cìrean in Gaelic, the Fhìdleir's Mound, and that protected the in-fields, and the cattle were sent to the outfields, which you can see stretching in front of you, way out there, to graze every day, and the women went out and milked them twice a day, and the boys of and the girls too of the hamlets spent the day looking after them and checking that they weren't running into bogs and things like that. But that's Clach Uaigh. Now, what was interesting was about this area is that one of the bishops who had their cathedra, as it were, that we've just been looking at down at Mochcarne, which was called Cill Éispig Harald, the monastic settlement of the Bishop Harold, he became sick to death of trying to collect his tithes and things, and his name was Fergus, I think, and he wasn't getting any help from the MacDougals of Dunolly, who were supposed to be collecting the tithes for him. So he engaged a real heavy called Sir John Campbell of Cawdor, who had married the heiress of Cawdor, and that's another story, because the Campbells, I think, captured her when she was of a young age and brought her up so that she would marry one of the younger sons of the Earl of Argyll, and that they would inherit the monies and the lands belonging to Cawdor. But he was a real heavy man, and he gathered together troops, and he and the MacDougall of Dunolly decided that they were going to have a trial by force of arms to see who would continue to collect the tithes. And this was in 1538, I think it was, or maybe 1532, I'm not quite sure. And they agreed to meet on a level piece of ground, which is in the middle ground to this left of this wood that you can see in front of you. and they would choose, I think, 6 men from each clan, and they would fight to the death, and the collection of tithes and things would fall to the clan of the person who's last standing, as it was. But they probably met at initially to discuss things at that stone, Clach Uaigh, because I think that was the function of that stone, and was continued to be the function of that stone later on. But I'll get this mixed up to a certain extent, but I think the Campbells were situated in dead ground behind this hill in Nighean, and the MacDougals were behind the high ground here somewhere. And the fight went on, and it wasn't going terribly well one way and another, and it got to the stage eventually where Carragh actually deployed the men that he had in the dead ground, and of course the MacDougals did the same, and they had a pitched battle there, which the Campbells eventually won. And the pipers were playing on this hill here. Do you see this hill?
Yeah.
They may have been closer, but that hill there is called in Gaelic Tolmafeepere, the Pipers' Hill. And pipers were like diplomats. They had diplomatic immunity, and they both played to encourage their respective sides, although there is a local tale that says that the MacDougall piper was saying, could he have 2 hands to play the pipes and one to wield the sword? But the Campbells, Sir John Campbell of Carragh, got the upper hand, and they remained having the upper hand in this area until one of the major Campbell families went bankrupt in the 1930s. So it's quite an ancient place there, very interesting from that point of view. We're now walking on up the Balindore Road, past that lovely view that we have up here, and are looking over now towards Tolmafeepere, where the pipers played for the Battle of Tallaght, which is just beyond this middle ground here. There's a piece of flat ground there where the battle took place in the 1500s, which resulted in the Campbells gaining control of, first of all, the tithes, and then a lot of the land around here. We've paused slightly here on this road because there's quite an interesting feature here which is best seen when the bracken's down. I've explained already that a lot of the land on this side of us here is actually the infields for the townships of Aird's Halfton and Ceàrd, and you can see very clearly, particularly when the light is low or it's a frosty day, you can see the lazy beds or the rig and furrow that the local people used to grow their oats and barley. It needed to be protected from the cattle, which were driven out every day to the common grazing, which is behind us here on my right. And the cattle were taken out and were milked twice daily out in the hill and looked after by the little boys and girls in the village, who made sure that they didn't run into danger or into any bogs or anything like that. But in order to keep them out there was a system whereby each township had what they called a head dyke. And the head dyke was a kind of a clod dyke, a clod wall, which might in some cases be have hawthorn bushes growing up above it to make a fairly good quickset hedge. And this here, in front of us here, is one example. The road is running through it, but if you follow this in the autumn, you'll find that the head dyke goes right round and encloses the ground that was cultivated, and meant that the cattle wouldn't get in, particularly if the children were actually doing their jobs properly. It runs behind us here, right down, and follows the line of a stream, and it crosses the stream down below, and it's quite easy to follow, and it's actually marked by the Ordnance Survey in some cases on the map. So it was quite an important feature for the townships of Ceàrd, Bay and Hafton. We've just come up the steep-ish hill here, which is called in Gaelic the Bruach, another of the red braes in the parish of Nighean, which is actually named after the very russet ochre soil that is at the side of the road, and was a distinctive feature of the old cart track and possibly the Pilgrim's Way that ran in this direction. We've seen Fhìdleir on our left-hand side as we've come up the hill, the very distinctive hill where the pipers played for the Battle of Dalach. And we're now standing at the top of the hill, and there's a rather interesting feature here that most people don't know about, and we're just going to walk up to it now because it's part of the village's history. The flat ground to my left here was a site where the travelling people had their annual camps as they passed through the area, and they always chose a place where there was good water close at hand and where there would be possibly shelter from the southwest wind, and where there was a good view. And I think the view up here is absolutely superb. Unfortunately, a tragedy happened, and I'll talk about that as we walk up to this area here. It's very difficult to see now because of this willow tree, but we might get in closer. But here there's a cairn, and the cairn is called Uaigh, Nighean and Ceàrd, the graveyard or the grave site of the young travelling woman. And what happened apparently was that when they were camping here, the girl died of a fever or some illness in their tents, and they just dug a grave here and buried her according to their own rites, and she had a cairn of stones piled over her in the old tradition, where we believed that a stone on the cairn was a memory of the girl or the person concerned. And there is a saying in Gaelic where you say, "Hami cur Clach H-Ighne," you know, I'm putting a stone of remembrance on the cairn of the person's memory. And that's what happened here with this girl, and she will stay here unknown to a great extent until the last day. The wooded hill in front of you has got a particular name, and it lies behind the travelling girl's grave, the tinker's grave. It's called in Gaelic Tunnag, which means the mound of the ducks. And why it's called that, we have no idea. It may well be that it was a favourite place. It's a bit boggy up there, where you could actually find wild ducks either roosting or feeding, and it's an interesting name from that point of view. And really, the whole landscape here has got quite a considerable significance, because people needed to know where the cattle were grazing. So if you had somewhere here called Tunnag, they could say the cattle are up there, and the children knew where to go to drive them in to the little enclosures that they had, where they could peg them down and milk them. And if you look to your left here, towards the hills of Glenlonnan, there's you can see the wind farm on the top of the hill there, which is really marking the way the old road ran across the hills into the next valley system. And in the middle ground here, we'll be looking at it later on as we carry on along the road, but there is quite an important boundary and an enclosure there, which is not obvious nowadays, but it was called the Ghortean Bail, and that means the black or dark coloured enclosure. And on the middle ridge there between here and the Lowland Hills, there's a very large boundary there, which is marked on the map and which must have formed the boundary of an estate, or it might even be much earlier than that and be a part of an Iron Age boundary. But it's marked on the map, and I'm glad that it has been preserved from that point of view. We're now further up the road and looking back towards Fhìdleir and looking right into what was known as Ghortean, the Black Enclosure. And on the horizon there in front of us, there are several trees growing on the ridge there, and just behind that is the earthwork that I was talking about, which obviously starts an important boundary, possibly with the estate of Bargillin or whatever. It's not obvious really what it was, but you can see it on the map, and it is the start of possibly an enclosure. So we're looking now towards the right, and there's a very green ridge just in the middle foreground there, and that is a very interesting place with a rock on top of it that you can't actually see at the moment, but I think that may have been some prehistoric sort of area of some kind. There's a very large erratic block up there, and it may have no significance whatsoever, but I always feel drawn to it when we go past. Now if we turn round, there's a very nice cow there that thinks we brought food for it. As we go round, we're seeing here in front of us very ancient forest. That is actually, although there is pine trees and things on the horizon, that is one of the ancient woods of the area, and it's called Barran in the foreground here, where there was an enclosure with a wood in it and a little hillock. Now the way we're looking, there's a river running down there that we'll see quite shortly, and it has carved itself out a path through there. But as we come round here, looking towards the north really here, there's a ridge here, and at the bottom of the ridge there's a very, very important clod dyke or field boundary which runs away into the distance in the north, down towards the main A85, and I suspect that was the main head dyke for the township of Balindore and Ghortean and a lot of the villages that were in this river valley. We know some of their names. There's Park Hill, that's Tunnag Park, on the side of the A85, and then there's Meadhonach here, where we'll see the drive down to it, which is a very sheltered croft there, and then there's Balindore, and then there's Ghortean, and then there was School, and then Bargillin. But there are other settlements whose names I've got in this river valley, particularly one which we know about called Cìrean. But the others, I've got their names, but not the place where they are to be found. And I've been looking fairly in vain on Google Earth to see whether I can identify the places where these little settlements were. But they were very important, just as important as Ceàrd or H-Ighne or any of the other ones, because they had their names and they had their people living in that river valley. We're standing now just at the drive down to a small holding called Meadhonach. Now the name is misspelt on this sign, but it's not the fault of the owners, it's the fault of possibly the original captains in the Royal Engineers who did the original survey and maybe got the thing misspelt. And it should be Meadhonach, the middle field. But of course, there might be a word after the na, which could be some indication of whatever was in the middle, because Meadhonach means in the middle. I haven't speculated on that, but it could be that it's Achadh Srú Meadhonach or something like that. But I don't know about that, because the only maps that I have show it as Achadh Meadhonach. There's a very interesting pool down there, just below the house, where there's a waterfall, and it used to be one of the favourite places for people from Balindore, and indeed from the village, to go, because the trout, the sea trout, used to have to leap this little waterfall in order to get up to the upper reaches of the river, where they had their gravel beds, where they bred and let down their eggs and so on, and the little fish would grow up and head off down river. My mother, when she was young, used to take this as a shortcut sometimes between here and Tinalt, by going straight over the hill when she came up to play with her cousins who were farming Balindore. And she told me that one time when she was crossing a little stream that's just here on my left-hand side, that she crossed the stream, but the stream itself was full of sea trout who were all spawning. So it shows the richness of the crop of sea trout that came up this river every year, and which no longer do so because of the pollution and the sea lice and the fishing that may actually occur out at sea, which is a great shame. Now behind me there's, and I'll just turn around to indicate it to you, there's a dike running across in front of us there, covered with heather, and I think that is a continuation of the dike that was up on the hill behind us there, and it was probably indicating that the land beyond that was common grazing, and the land inside that was the land where the crops could be grown. But I wonder about that, because it actually continues up the top here and joins the big dike at the very top. So it may be a relic of a much older system of land tenure. We're not quite sure. We've now come up the road further and are just entering the little hamlet of Balindore, and I'll be explaining what that means in a few minutes. But we're looking back here at that enclosure, which was called Barran, which means an enclosure which might have a hedge round it, and where they could keep cattle or goats or even sheep, because they used goats and goat's milk and sheep's milk as part of their diet in the 18th century and before that. The Barran itself is quite of interest to me, because my grandmother was brought up in Balindore here, as was my grandfather, and my grandmother used to say that there's a sickly girl in the village who had marvellous powers of recovery, and she said in Gaelic that she would be, one day she would be dying, and the next day she'd be running about in Barran as though there was nothing wrong with her whatsoever. So every time I go past Barran, I think of my grandmother saying, "Oh, that vai rishivar," because now that vai rifio Barran. And I don't know who the girl was or what happened to her in the end, but that's just a little vignette, as it were. And down below us here, behind me, we have the river running, the river valley running, and when we get a better view of it, I'll let you know about the history of the river itself. But in the meantime, if we pan round now, we'll just see one of the dwellings, one of many, where there are ruins all over the place here, that forms part of Balindore. And in a moment or two we'll see one ruined building to our right, which may either have been a dwelling house or possibly it was a byre connected with the house here. But these cottages are quite old. They may not look old, but they are in essence, although extended possibly, they are 18th century houses. And this one here is definitely an 18th century house. It's got square corners rather than rounded corners, this ruin that you see on my right hand side here. We're looking now up the valley of the river Luachragan. Now that's a very interesting name because it means the rushy one, as in rushes growing at the side of the river. And it used to be a very good trout, brown trout and sea trout stream, and it runs down towards Lochethib. During its course down the river, it has three names. At the top end, on the slopes of H-Ighne, the mountain of the good view, it's called Achadh, which means the stream of the hawk. And when it runs through Angus's garden, which we'll see later on in this series, it comes down, and at that stage it becomes the river Luachragan, the rushy one. And as it goes downstream and past the waterfall where we said the trout could be caught, it becomes Altnahish, then Nuge's stream. And then when it crosses under the bridge at Macairn, it becomes Altavruin, which means a lot of different things depending on how you interpret it, and we'll be doing that in a later bit of the series as well. And it comes out to the sea at Lochethib in an area called, strangely enough, Australia, because the people that were living there had been to Australia, and they thought the bushland that's around there with all the birch trees and things were rather like parts of the Australian bush, so they called it Australia. Now the river itself is quite important historically as well, because there's one bit of it just above the waterfall, which is got a very interesting name. It's called Linne Nighean, and in Gaelic that means the pool of the that means the pool of the young maiden, but it probably actually refers to a water sprite or a water nymph, and is indication that even before any religious significance of this place, that it was a place where people worshipped possibly the spirits of the area, and possibly this water nymph who was supposed to dwell in that pool. And I can remember it when I was a little boy, because I used to come and stay here at Ballinjore with my mother because her uncle farmed it at the time, and the family that's in there now are the third generation to live in the place. And she used to come over, my mother, for a few weeks in the summer, and we used to take a holiday cottage somewhere in the area, but sometimes we stayed with our cousins in Ballinjore, and it was a very exciting place to be a young boy. And I can remember living in the house and being met at the station by a horse and cart, and my cousin Johnny driving it, as it were, and we came up and we used to cross over the ford that's in the river, because there's only a footbridge at that stage, and up to the house past the pig shed where there was a pigsty there and a pig in it which was let out on occasions to run around, and a byre which was very full of sweet hay and had house cows in it, and into the house itself. And it was a very comfortable place to live. It was heated by peat fires, and the baking was always done by an oven with peat burning around the outside of it, as far as I can recall. They had a very nice little cool house where they put the milk after it had been milked, so that the cream would come to the surface and be collected. And my cousin Bella made butter with the cream, fresh butter, which tasted very good. And she was an excellent baker, and she used to win prizes at the local horticultural show for Victoria sponges that were made with in the oven, which was fired up by peat, and which she used their own milk and their own butter to make. And there was a productive garden at the back where there were all kinds of raspberries and blackberries and apple trees and whatnot, and very rich soil which grew vegetables and things. And the Victoria sponge would have her own jam in the middle of it, and they were absolutely delightful to eat. And I can remember going downstream with my cousin Johnny and seeing Linne Nighean that I was mentioning just now, and it had that lovely peat-coloured water which you could see through right to the bottom, and there were trees hanging over it. And one of my earliest memories is seeing the sunlight dappling on the bottom of the stream. And they always had trout at the farm because it was a good place to catch fish, as we were saying, below the waterfall and also above the waterfall. And in this area here where you can see the past this rowan tree here, you can see the river going backwards and looping across the whole area. Now you can see it's still under cultivation. My cousin John is cultivating it, and he's got cattle here as well. But at one stage, when there were many people, possibly up to 80 people living in this area in various little houses, some of them which have disappeared because they're probably built of clods anyway. And this whole area was on both sides of the river was cultivated, and it would be quite productive. And my grandfather, who was a bit of a bard and was a police officer in Glasgow, he was born and brought up here, and he had a lot of nostalgia for this place, and he wrote a very fine song called Ceàrd and Bruach in Gaelic, which means the songs of the young maidens. And it was all about the kind of rural life where the girls sang when they were milking the cows and so on. It was a lovely rural scene that he painted, and he said that of all the sounds of any instruments in the world which he liked, it was the sound of the young women singing while they were milking the cattle, as it were. Now, we've seen a picture of probably the oldest house in the current Balindore township, and it is probably on the site of maybe several former houses, because the name Balindore is very interesting because it refers to a Jor, which is a jewer or the keeper of a relic. And the relic in question was actually a pastoral staff which belonged to St. Mulrua, who in the 6th century had a settlement around the Black Lochs in outside Connell. And there is ample evidence, both archaeological and documentary, that St. Mulrua had a settlement around the Black Lochs there, and that he had a pastoral staff, which in Gaelic was called the Ardvachel, which means the great high staff, the most important staff. Although I think probably Neil Bachel of Lismore might actually debate that particular question, because his Bachel, in the one that he is the keeper of in Lismore, is possibly older than this one. But St. Mulrua had a settlement there, and the Bachel, his Ardvachel, was given in charge to a hereditary family who took charge of the Bachel and looked after it, and eventually it became a very revered object and was used for people coming to get a blessing from touching it, to get holy water possibly that it had been dipped in, to swear oaths on it, and to authenticate documents by swearing on the Bachel. And it was an important thing, and the man the jewer, moved around a lot with the Bachel itself, and went to various areas where the magic properties of the Bachel could be used for oaths, as I say, or signing important documents and all that sort of thing. And I know I've seen a bond from Inverera Castle, which was actually sworn on the Bachel and on the Mass book at what they called the Isle of St. Mulrua, the island of St. Mulrua, which is a crannog in the Black Lochs. And it was so the oath for this bond was sworn on the Mass book and on the Ardvachel itself, and that was in the 16th century. Now, after that, the Bachel vanishes from history, and the reason for that is a folk tale which may or may not be true, but it's a good one anyway. Apparently, the men of Balindore here around were away reaving cattle or stealing cattle, because that was one of the ways they could increase their wealth, as it were, by stealing them from other people. And it also sharpened up their skills as soldiers, and because there was fighting involved, and in navigation across country and all the various other things. And the place was empty except for one of their company who was a weakling or a jor, and he couldn't go. And apparently a band of troubadours or wandering musicians came to the area and settled down and started making free with all the food and the drink and the women. And this fellow wasn't capable of dealing with this at all. So he was splitting log. Now, if we just turn the camera around and head in this direction to look up into that re-entrant up there, just beyond the crops. he had cut a big oak tree there, and apparently was in progress of splitting it with a hammer and a wedge, and he had it more or less open. So he said to all these musicians, "Look, would you come and help me with this? I want to pull this tree into two. It's nearly splitting." So they went up with him, and in that re-entrant was this log there, right enough. And he said, "Put your fingers in and on both sides and pull, and it'll maybe come apart." Well, when they did that, he knocked out the wedge that was in the top that was splitting it, and the tree closed on their hands. And then he went round and cut their throats. And when the men got back, they were so horrified by this act of, not hospitality, quite the opposite. It was a breach of Highland hospitality, and they drove Walter Campbell, the Ceàrd, out of there, and he went off into history somewhere else, and so did the Bachel with him, and we don't know what happened to it. But I'm led to believe that even in this century, there was a byre or a cowshed in Meadhonach, and it was actually, we've seen Meadhonach just downriver from Balindore here, and the byre actually had trees or trunks built into the wall to stabilize it, and they were from that tree that was actually knocked down in the 16th century by this Walter Campbell, who was the doer of the Bachel and looked after it, and was sent away, and the Bachel went with him. Just a further footnote to this is that one of the reasons that I think that this route that we're following here was the original route that went up into Glenlonnan, through which passed the corpses of the kings of Scotland and pilgrims who were going through Glenlonnan to Lochfeuchen to go out to the island of Iona, because this would be a natural place for pilgrims to come to, because all of the place names round this area have got religious significance. For instance, this wood at the back of Balindore itself is actually called Tom Ile Christe, which means the rounded hill of the servant of Christ. But it could also mean Gilchrist's Hill, so you could take it one way or the other. And in this area here, in front of Tom Ile Christe, there are various places that can't be cultivated, as you can see, and one of them, I'm not quite sure which, is called Erin Vichloi. Now, that can mean the land share belonging to Macluai, but it could also be referring to a Celtic saint called Luagh. We're not quite sure about that, but behind me here, just on the south side here, there's a glen runs up right onto the Glenlonnan Road, and it was called Gleon Ilechunnig in Gaelic, which means the glen of the servant of Kenneth, and Kenneth was a saint. So the whole place has actually got a religious feel about it, or did in the 17th and 16th and 15th century, and I feel that this would be a place where the pilgrims would want to come on their way into Glenlonnan, which is where we're going now. We're now at a little house called Ghortean, which means enclosure, and I think this was called Junction-Balindore, you know, Balindore's enclosure, and it's been occupied probably since the 18th century, if not earlier, by a succession of families, and it latterly was in the hands of the former owner of the estate of Bargillan, who turned it into a very comfortable home and a very hospitable home where he and his artist wife lived, and he was a great gardener and maintainer of Angus's garden, which we'll mention when we go through Glenlonnan. And there's quite a sad story about Ghortean, in that one of the families, I'm not quite sure whether it was MacGregor or one of the other families that actually occupied the place, but the man was ill and he was dying of tuberculosis, and his family heard him on one early summer evening or late spring evening where there was a lot of mist about and there was a cuckoo calling from the woods, and he quoted a piece of poetry from his deathbed, which said, H-Ighne nach Trualecht mo... Sorry, I'll start that again if I may. H-Ighne nach Trualecht mo chui, smí gosnich Uaigh Ceàrd, which means in English, O cuckoo of the woods, are you not sad to see my breathing and my sighing here on an evening where the mist is rising from the woods on Carragh?